Evelyn never argued when hardship came, because she had been taught that storms spent themselves faster against people who stood firm instead of shouting at the wind. She carried that lesson from childhood into every season of her life, and even when the world seemed determined to strip away every certainty she possessed, there remained inside her a quiet place no one could steal. The little valley outside Ashridge Crossing had shaped people that way. Winters bit hard enough to split fence rails. Summers baked the earth until dust settled over every porch like brown flour. And yet the people who remained learned that endurance was not a dramatic act, but 1,000 ordinary decisions made before sunrise. Evelyn had watched her father make those decisions every morning of his life. Silas Rowan had never owned much beyond a modest farmhouse, a vegetable patch, and a wagon repaired so many times that very little of its original wood remained. Still, every neighbor believed that if something needed fixing, Silas would somehow find a way. He understood timber the way others understood conversation. A cracked beam, a loose wheel, a warped cabinet, or a broken chair all seemed to reveal their troubles to him the moment his weathered hands touched them. He often told his daughter that every piece of wood remembered the tree from which it came, and if a craftsman listened carefully enough, it would reveal what it wished to become again. Evelyn smiled at those strange sayings as a child, yet she listened closely because she loved hearing the confidence in his voice. Her mother, Miriam, balanced those quiet philosophies with practical wisdom. She managed every coin that entered their home without ever making poverty feel shameful. She stitched clothes until they looked almost new again, stretched soups to feed unexpected visitors, and insisted that generosity never depended upon wealth. Whenever travelers stopped at their gate asking only for water, they left with warm bread wrapped inside clean cloth. Miriam never counted what she gave away because she believed blessings were measured differently from money. The house itself reflected those values. Shelves sagged beneath carefully repaired books whose covers had faded beyond recognition. An old clock lost several minutes every day, but remained proudly displayed because it had belonged to Evelyn's grandfather. The dining table bore countless scratches from decades of work, laughter, and shared meals. Nothing inside the Rowan home was valuable by the standards of wealthy merchants, yet every object carried memory. Evelyn grew believing that usefulness mattered more than appearance, that stories hid inside ordinary things, and that people deserved patience before judgment. As she grew older, she became almost as skilled with tools as her father. He never treated her curiosity as unusual. Instead, he handed her hammers, saws, and measuring lines as naturally as another parent might hand over knitting needles. Soon she could rebuild cabinet drawers, replace loose floorboards, and carve replacement handles for broken furniture. She discovered she especially loved desks because they seemed to preserve the lives of everyone who had ever leaned across them. Tiny knife marks, ink stains, initials hidden beneath drawers, and polished edges where hands had rested for years, all suggested invisible histories waiting to be imagined. Sometimes she wondered who had written hopeful letters upon those surfaces, or signed deeds that changed entire families. Her father would laugh softly whenever he found her staring thoughtfully at an old desk. "Wood keeps secrets," he would say, "not forever, only until the right hands arrive." Those words settled quietly into her heart, long before either of them realized how true they would someday become. Life continued peacefully until illness entered the valley, with cruel determination. A fever spread after one unusually wet spring, stealing strength from young and old alike. Miriam weakened first. Though she fought bravely through long nights, her gentle voice gradually faded until silence settled over the little farmhouse. Silas never fully recovered from losing her. He continued working because work was all he knew, yet the laughter disappeared from his eyes. Evelyn became his partner in every task, trying to fill spaces grief had hollowed out, but some emptiness refused to be repaired. Years later, another accident finally claimed him. A heavy oak shifted unexpectedly during a storm cleanup, and although neighbors rushed to help, the injuries proved too severe. The valley mourned the man who had quietly repaired half its homes without ever asking more than honest payment. Standing beside the modest graves of her parents beneath the whispering cottonwoods, Evelyn understood for the first time that adulthood sometimes arrived not with celebration, but with unbearable responsibility. Still, she remained in the farmhouse because leaving would have felt like abandoning everything they had taught her. Every repaired chair, every carefully fitted shelf, every garden row reminded her that love could linger inside labor. She worked wherever she found employment, restoring furniture for merchants, repairing wagons for farmers, even rebuilding church pews after harsh winters split their joints. People admired her skill, yet admiration alone rarely filled empty pockets. Seasons grew increasingly difficult. Railroads redirected trade toward larger towns, wealthy investors purchased surrounding land, and independent craftsmen found fewer customers each passing year. Ashridge Crossing slowly changed into a place where profit mattered more than neighbors, and the old customs of trust began fading beneath contracts, debts, and whispered bargains. Evelyn watched those changes with quiet concern, never imagining they were leading her toward the lonely afternoon when every possession she still owned would fit inside 2 canvas bags, and the abandoned telegraph station waiting beyond the weeds would become the only place in the world willing to receive her. The true beginning of her downfall arrived not with thunder, but with signatures. Men wearing polished boots and expensive coats appeared carrying folded maps marked with straight black lines that ignored streams, gardens, orchards, and memories alike. They represented the Ashridge Development Company, an organization that promised modern warehouses, expanded railway sidings, and prosperity for everyone willing to sell. Some families accepted generous offers, believing brighter futures waited elsewhere. Others hesitated until taxes unexpectedly increased on the remaining independent properties. What had once been manageable suddenly became crushing. Old neighbors whispered that someone inside the county office had been persuaded to reassess the land, though no one possessed proof. Evelyn noticed only the results. Bills grew larger while repair work became scarcer. Wealthier customers now preferred factory-made furniture shipped from distant cities. Those pieces lacked character, but they arrived cheaply enough to tempt even practical families. Month after month, she watched unfinished projects disappear from her workshop until silence became her most regular visitor. She responded the only way she knew. She rose earlier, accepted smaller payments, repaired belongings others considered worthless, and traveled farther searching for work. Sometimes, she walked 20 miles to restore a single rocking chair. Other days, she returned home carrying nothing except aching feet and stubborn hope. Hope, however, could not satisfy tax collectors. The company eventually purchased neighboring farms until Evelyn's little property stood isolated among acres already marked for redevelopment. One afternoon, a representative named Horace Bell visited, carrying an offer written upon crisp paper. He smiled politely while explaining that her land would soon become difficult to access once construction began. Selling now, he assured her, would spare unnecessary hardship. Evelyn thanked him yet refused. She could not imagine exchanging the home built by her parents for coins that would soon vanish. Horace's pleasant expression cooled ever so slightly before he tucked away the unsigned document. "Sentiment," he remarked quietly, "rarely survives progress." Those words lingered unpleasantly long after his carriage disappeared beyond the hill. Weeks later, the county announced overdue taxes that exceeded anything she had ever owed. She gathered every saved dollar, sold treasured tools she had inherited from her father, parted with Miriam's silver serving spoon, and even surrendered the old grandfather clock, whose slow ticking had comforted lonely evenings for years. Still, the amount remained beyond her reach. Friends wished to help, but they themselves struggled beneath similar burdens. Pride prevented many from admitting how close they stood to ruin. The auction notice arrived pinned to her front gate, beneath gray morning skies. She removed it carefully, folded it once, and carried it inside without tears. Grief often became strangely quiet after exhausting itself. On the appointed day, only a handful of people attended. The farmhouse, barn, vegetable garden, workshop, and surrounding land sold together for less than Evelyn believed the timber alone deserved. Horace Bell purchased everything on behalf of the company without displaying triumph. To him, it was merely another transaction completed before lunch. Evelyn remained until every document had been signed. Before leaving, she walked slowly through each empty room, allowing her fingertips to brush familiar walls one final time. In the workshop, she paused beside the sturdy workbench where Silas had taught her how to measure twice before cutting once. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows exactly as it always had, illuminating tiny curls of wood still trapped between floorboards from projects completed years earlier. She knelt and picked up one small shaving, no larger than a feather. It carried the faint scent of oak despite the passing seasons. She slipped it into her pocket without quite knowing why. It felt wrong to leave with nothing from the place that had shaped her entire life. By sunset, she stood alone beside the road, carrying 2 canvas bags, a toolbox reduced to only essential instruments, her father's folding rule, and 43 cents remaining after settling every final obligation she could. She never looked back while walking away because she feared the sight of strangers already measuring her parents' garden would weaken the resolve keeping her feet moving. For several days, she wandered from town to town seeking employment. Boarding houses demanded payment she could not spare. Churches offered meals but little permanent shelter. She slept one rainy evening beneath a wagon shed, another inside an abandoned sheep barn, and once beneath the broad porch of a closed general store after obtaining permission from its kindly owner. Though embarrassed by her circumstances, she refused to surrender her dignity. Every morning she washed carefully at public pumps, brushed dust from her clothes, and presented herself as though fortune might improve before noon. Some employers admired her craftsmanship, but claimed business had slowed too greatly to hire anyone. Others simply assumed a woman traveling alone could not possibly possess the skills she described. Days stretched into weeks. The 43 cents dwindled to 38, then 29, then 18. Hunger sharpened every smell drifting from bakery windows. She repaired a broken crate for a grocer in exchange for stale bread, fixed a schoolteacher's rocking chair for warm stew, and mended children's toys because seeing them smile reminded her why craftsmanship mattered, even when no ledger recorded the payment. One cool autumn morning, she arrived in the fading railroad settlement of Black Alder, a place that seemed suspended between memory and abandonment. The railway company had rerouted its primary line years earlier, leaving only occasional freight trains rumbling through without stopping. Empty storefronts faced streets where weeds pushed confidently between cracked boards. At the edge of town stood an abandoned telegraph station, leaning slightly beneath years of neglect, its weathered sign barely readable beneath peeling paint. Windows stared outward like tired eyes, and vines climbed patiently across the walls as though nature intended to erase every trace of human urgency once carried through those wires. Townsfolk hardly noticed the building anymore. Children avoided it because older generations insisted strange sounds drifted from within after sunset. Merchants dismissed it as worthless. Yet as Evelyn stood watching the forgotten station beneath the pale morning light, she experienced the same quiet feeling she had often known while examining broken furniture others intended to burn. Neglect had settled over the building, but beneath that neglect she sensed careful workmanship waiting to be acknowledged once again. She did not yet know that inside one weathered desk, concealed within wood, crafted by hands as patient as her father's, a message had been waiting through decades of silence for someone exactly like her to finally hear it. She crossed the empty street slowly, almost expecting someone to laugh at the idea of anyone showing interest in the neglected building. No one did. The barber sweeping his porch scarcely looked up. 2 boys chasing each other around an abandoned freight wagon ran past without so much as glancing toward the station. It had become invisible through familiarity, the way people eventually stop noticing an old tree or a cracked church bell that has stood in the same place for decades. The station sat behind a sagging split-rail fence, with its gate hanging from a single rusted hinge. Tall grass brushed against Evelyn's skirt as she approached the porch. Every board beneath her boots groaned with the slow complaint of old timber that had spent too many winters unprotected. The telegraph wires stretching away from the building no longer carried messages. Most had snapped years before, leaving only a few strands humming faintly whenever the wind crossed the valley. She rested one hand upon the weathered door. The wood felt dry but solid. "Still standing," she whispered. It reminded her of something her father might have said after examining an old cabinet that everyone else wanted to throw away. The lock had already been removed. Inside, pale shafts of sunlight spilled through broken windows, revealing countless dust particles drifting lazily through the stale air. Shelves lined one wall, many still holding cracked ledgers whose pages curled from moisture. Rusted telegraph equipment rested beneath yellowing cloths. A calendar from years earlier still hung crookedly beside the dispatch window, frozen forever in a forgotten month. Everything smelled of old pine, ink, and time. She moved carefully, almost respectfully, as though entering someone else's memory. Near the rear of the station stood the operator's desk. Unlike the surrounding furniture, it immediately caught her attention. The desk had been built from black walnut rather than common pine. Its craftsmanship exceeded everything else inside the building. Elegant dovetail joints still held firmly despite the years. Brass drawer pulls had tarnished almost black, but beneath the discoloration she could still see delicate engravings. Someone had invested both pride and patience into building it. She smiled despite herself. Her father would have admired it. Kneeling beside one leg, she examined the construction closely. Someone had repaired one corner decades earlier using a different variety of wood. The repair was skillful enough to escape casual notice, yet not invisible to trained eyes. "Whoever built you cared," she murmured. The building's current owner, an elderly merchant named Edwin Mercer, arrived carrying a ring of keys, though none were necessary anymore. "You've got an eye for old things," he observed. "I've spent most of my life repairing them." He chuckled. "Not many would bother." "How much are you asking?" Mercer scratched thoughtfully beneath his beard. "The railway sold me this place years ago. Truth be told, it's done nothing except collect rainwater and pigeons." He looked around the room before shrugging. "If you can spare 25 cents, it's yours. Building, desk, shelves, junk and all." 25 cents. More than half the money she possessed. She lowered her eyes. Once that payment was made, only 13 cents would remain. No sensible person would spend nearly everything on an abandoned telegraph station. She understood that perfectly. Yet she also understood something few others did. Buildings, like people, often revealed their worth only after someone believed in them. She slowly reached into her pocket. The coins felt surprisingly heavy. One by one, they landed in the old merchant's weathered palm. He counted them carefully before handing her a folded deed. "I suppose congratulations are in order," he said with an amused smile. "You've just become the owner of Black Alder's most useless building." Evelyn smiled politely. "Perhaps." After Mercer departed, silence settled over the station once more. For the first time in many weeks, she possessed something no creditor could immediately take away. It was little more than 4 walls and a leaking roof. Yet it belonged to her. She spent the remainder of the afternoon opening windows, sweeping years of accumulated dust, and carrying broken crates outside. Birds fluttered from the rafters in noisy protest. Spiderwebs disappeared beneath her broom. Sunlight gradually reached corners that had remained dark for years. As evening approached, she finally turned her attention toward the operator's magnificent desk. It weighed far more than she expected. After considerable effort, she managed to drag it closer to the window, where fading daylight illuminated every surface. She removed each drawer individually. Most contained ordinary remnants of a forgotten workplace: broken pencils, empty ink bottles, rusted telegraph components, old receipts whose writing had faded almost beyond recognition. Nothing remarkable. Still, something continued bothering her. She ran her fingertips beneath the desktop. Solid. She measured its thickness. Oddly thick, far thicker than necessary. Her father had taught her that unnecessary thickness often concealed forgotten repairs, or hidden compartments. She smiled. "Let's see what secret you're keeping." She turned the desk onto its side with considerable effort. Dust exploded into the air. Using the small brass screwdriver from her toolbox, she began removing several tiny screws securing the rear panel. Most resisted fiercely. One snapped. Another refused to move until she carefully applied lamp oil around its threads. Nearly an hour passed. Finally, the panel loosened. Behind it appeared nothing. Only another smooth wooden surface. She frowned. Had she imagined the unusual construction? She tapped gently across the hidden board with the handle of her screwdriver. Tap, 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 thunk. She stopped immediately. One section sounded different, not solid, hollow. Her heartbeat quickened. Carefully, she examined the grain. There, barely visible, a hairline seam so perfectly matched that decades of dust had nearly erased every trace. She reached for her smallest carving knife. Sliding its thin blade delicately into the seam, she applied gentle pressure. Nothing. She tried again. A faint click echoed inside the desk. The narrow wooden panel shifted less than half an inch. Evelyn froze. Slowly, very slowly, she pulled the concealed panel outward. A hidden compartment emerged from inside the hollow center of the desk, no larger than a loaf of bread, perfectly dry despite the passing decades. Inside rested a small brass cylinder wrapped in faded oilcloth. Beside it lay a single leather-bound notebook tied with blue ribbon that had almost turned gray with age. She stared silently. Someone had hidden these items deliberately. Someone had expected they might someday be found. Outside, the evening wind stirred the abandoned telegraph wires. For the briefest moment, they hummed softly above the lonely station, sounding almost like distant voices, finally preparing to finish a conversation interrupted many years before. Evelyn carried the brass cylinder to the window where the last ribbons of sunlight still reached across the scarred surface of the old desk. She did not rush. Whoever had hidden these things had expected them to remain undiscovered for many years, perhaps forever, and it seemed wrong to greet such patience with haste. The oilcloth crackled softly as she unfolded it. Despite its age, it had protected the contents remarkably well. The brass still retained a dull golden sheen beneath the dust, its cap threaded so precisely that even decades had failed to seize it shut. She twisted gently until it loosened with a soft metallic sigh. Inside rested a tightly rolled sheet of heavy paper bound with faded crimson thread. She untied it carefully, afraid that one careless movement might reduce history to fragments. Instead, the parchment slowly uncurled beneath her fingertips, revealing elegant handwriting so steady and deliberate that she immediately imagined the writer seated exactly where she now stood. The ink had browned with age, yet every word remained astonishingly clear. Across the top, written in careful script, appeared only a date: October 18th, 1881. Beneath it were 6 simple words: "To whoever finally finds this message." Evelyn drew a slow breath. The letter did not begin like ordinary correspondence. It felt less like something written for one person, and more like a conversation with the future itself. "If these words are being read," the writer began, "then either justice has finally found courage, or silence has lasted far longer than any honest man deserved." She leaned closer. The name signed beneath the opening paragraph stopped her heart for an instant. Nathaniel Ashcombe. She knew the name. Every child raised anywhere near Black Alder had heard it. Nathaniel Ashcombe had been remembered as the ambitious railroad surveyor whose mysterious disappearance had nearly destroyed the town 40 years earlier. According to local stories, he had vanished while transporting payroll money meant for railroad workers. The funds had disappeared with him. Some claimed he had stolen everything and fled west. Others insisted highwaymen murdered him beyond the river. A few elderly residents still lowered their voices whenever his name arose, as though betrayal itself lingered in the syllables. The official account had always remained simple. Nathaniel Ashcombe had betrayed his employers, abandoned Black Alder, and condemned the town to disgrace. Yet the words before Evelyn painted an entirely different picture. "I have not stolen $1 entrusted to me," the letter continued. "The accusations will come because they have already been prepared. They require only my absence to become accepted as truth." Evelyn felt a chill pass through the empty station. Someone had expected to be falsely accused before the accusation had even been made. She continued reading. Nathaniel described discovering corruption within the railroad company itself. Senior officials, together with influential investors, had secretly redirected public construction funds into private accounts while forcing small settlements like Black Alder to bear impossible taxes and fabricated debts. Honest books had been replaced with false ledgers. Land had been seized through manufactured obligations. Families who refused to sell had been quietly ruined until surrender became their only option. Evelyn paused, staring through the dusty window toward the quiet streets beyond. The similarities to her own experience unsettled her deeply. Different generation, different company, different names. Yet the methods sounded hauntingly familiar. The letter continued. Nathaniel explained that he had copied every genuine account before the false records replaced them. Those copies, together with signed statements from witnesses, had been concealed somewhere only an honest finder would discover. He dared not trust courts already influenced by powerful men. He dared not trust fellow employees whose loyalties had been purchased. Even the Telegraph office itself had become dangerous, because messages exposing the scheme were intercepted before leaving town. Then came one heartbreaking sentence. If I cannot deliver the truth myself, perhaps time will find someone kinder than my own generation proved to be. Evelyn slowly lowered the letter. Outside, twilight deepened over Black Alder. A freight train rumbled somewhere beyond the distant hills, its lonely whistle echoing across the valley. She imagined Nathaniel hearing a similar whistle while writing those words 4 decades earlier, never knowing whether anyone would ever believe him. Carefully, she opened the leather notebook lying beside the cylinder. Unlike the letter, its pages contained detailed entries: dates, names, figures, deliveries, property transfers, payments made under unusual circumstances. At first, the numbers appeared meaningless, but as she turned more pages, patterns emerged. Certain parcels of land repeatedly changed ownership within weeks, each time increasing dramatically in value after railroad surveys mysteriously shifted. Taxes rose only on properties whose owners resisted selling. Entire neighborhoods had been emptied through legal procedures that seemed proper individually, yet formed something deeply troubling when viewed together. Tucked inside the notebook rested a folded map drawn by hand. Black Alder appeared at its center, surrounded by farms, timberlands, and the river crossing. Tiny marks identified locations unfamiliar to modern residents. One symbol, however, caught Evelyn's attention immediately. A small red star had been placed beside the words, "Old Freight Vault." She frowned thoughtfully. She had never heard anyone mention such a place. Another loose page slipped free as she unfolded the map. Upon it, Nathaniel had written, "The originals remain where only those who remember freight before passengers will think to search. Trust not the visible building but the stone beneath." Evelyn read the sentence 3 times. The visible building but the stone beneath. She looked around the abandoned station. Stone beneath. Freight before passengers. Suddenly she remembered passing an old loading platform behind the station while clearing weeds earlier that afternoon. Most of it had collapsed long ago. Only a weathered foundation remained visible beneath creeping vines. She carried the lantern outside. Night had nearly settled, but curiosity outweighed exhaustion. The rear yard lay silent except for crickets singing among the tall grass. Behind the station, the remains of the original freight platform stretched beside abandoned tracks, now rusted almost orange. Thick vines covered most of the stone foundation. Kneeling, Evelyn brushed away leaves until cold granite emerged beneath her hands. One block differed slightly from the others. Its surface carried shallow scratches that did not resemble weathering. They looked intentional. 3 small chisel marks arranged in the shape of a triangle. She remembered similar marks her father sometimes used while assembling hidden joints in fine furniture. They were never decorative. They were instructions. Using the short pry bar from her toolbox, she carefully inserted the flattened end into a narrow crack beside the marked stone. It resisted at first. Then, with surprising ease, the granite shifted upward. Not entirely. Only enough to reveal darkness beneath. Her lantern illuminated a narrow cavity lined with brick. Moisture glistened along the walls, yet inside rested a rectangular iron box elevated upon two stone supports above the damp earth. She stared speechless. Nathaniel had hidden far more than a letter. Somehow the box had survived untouched through 40 years of neglect. She reached down carefully, lifting it with both hands. It was astonishingly heavy. The rusted lock had long since failed, breaking apart almost immediately beneath gentle pressure from her hammer. The lid creaked open. Inside lay bundles of sealed documents wrapped in waxed cloth, several official ledgers bearing railroad company seals, and dozens of unopened telegrams tied together with faded string. Each telegram displayed the same stamped notation: "Not delivered." Evelyn's pulse quickened. These were not forgotten messages. They had been deliberately prevented from reaching their intended recipients. Every sealed envelope represented a decision that had altered lives. Every ledger perhaps contained proof capable of rewriting the history of Black Alder itself. She looked toward the quiet town where lamps now glowed warmly behind curtains. Most of the people sleeping there believed they understood their own past. None suspected that beneath an abandoned freight platform, only a few yards from a forgotten telegraph station, the truth had waited patiently through 4 decades for someone willing to listen before deciding what justice truly required. Evelyn carried the iron box back inside the telegraph station and closed the door behind her, not because she believed someone had seen her discovery, but because certain moments deserved the dignity of silence. She placed the box upon the walnut desk where Nathaniel Ashcombe himself had once worked, lit a second lantern, and began laying out its contents one careful bundle at a time. Every document had been wrapped with extraordinary care. Waxed cloth, tied string, sealed envelopes, and neatly folded ledgers suggested that the man who hid them had expected years to pass before another pair of honest hands touched them. Dust had settled everywhere else inside the station, yet these papers had slept untouched beneath stone and timber, preserved as though time itself had stood guard. She untied the first bundle. Inside rested the original accounting books of the Black Alder Railway Division. The leather covers had darkened with age, but the pages remained crisp. Nathaniel's own notes filled the margins in precise handwriting, each observation cross-referenced with dates, freight numbers, payroll records, and land transactions. Evelyn quickly realized that this was no ordinary bookkeeping. Every false entry had been matched beside the genuine one. Every altered payment pointed toward another document proving how the deception had been carried out. The second bundle proved even more astonishing. It contained deeds belonging to nearly 30 families who had supposedly surrendered their land voluntarily. Yet each deed carried additional affidavits signed by witnesses declaring that the owners had never agreed to sell. Several signatures appeared forged. Others had been obtained while the rightful owners believed they were merely acknowledging tax notices or freight receipts. Nathaniel had carefully collected every contradiction before someone could destroy the evidence. Then Evelyn reached the unopened telegrams. There were 63 of them. Each remained folded exactly as it had left another telegraph office decades earlier. She chose one at random. The envelope bore the address of Elias Brewer, proprietor of Brewer's Mill, Black Alder. The message inside read, "Stop all property transfer immediately. Fraud discovered. Federal inspector departs tomorrow." Stamped across the front in bold red ink were the words, "Never delivered." She opened another. Addressed to Judge Abram Keller. "Do not certify land claims until original survey arrives." Again, "Never delivered." Another. To Sheriff Martin Hale. "Witness under protection arriving Thursday. Ensure safe passage." Never delivered. Another. To Nathaniel himself. "Leave town immediately. Your life in danger." Never delivered. Evelyn sat back slowly. It was no accident. Someone had intercepted every message capable of exposing the conspiracy. Entire lives had changed because words never reached their destination. Families had lost homes. Witnesses had vanished. Judges had ruled without crucial evidence. Sheriffs had waited for people who never arrived. History itself had been rewritten by silence. Her eyes drifted toward the abandoned telegraph key, resting upon a nearby shelf. How strange, she thought, that a building created to connect distant people had instead become the place where truth had been imprisoned. Near the bottom of the iron box rested one final envelope unlike all the others. Across its front appeared only 3 handwritten words, "If I fail." Inside lay a much longer letter. Nathaniel's writing seemed less controlled than before. The ink occasionally thickened where the pen had paused too long. "We have reached the point where honesty has become more dangerous than theft. They know I possess copies of the genuine records. Mr. Barstow believes I intend to flee with the payroll because that is precisely the story he intends to spread after I disappear. If these papers survive me, whoever discovers them must understand one thing above all others. The money was never the true prize. Land was. Entire valleys were stolen while decent people argued over a missing payroll they would never recover. By chasing coins, everyone overlooked the deeds." Evelyn frowned. Mr. Barstow. The name appeared repeatedly throughout the ledgers. Edmund Barstow, Regional Railway Superintendent. Every questionable transaction eventually pointed back to him. Nathaniel continued, "I leave these records because truth deserves more patience than lies. Lies arrive quickly. Truth often walks alone for many years before anyone recognizes her footsteps." Colts. Those words settled heavily inside the quiet room. Truth often walks alone. Evelyn understood that feeling better than she wished. She herself had walked alone through towns where no one believed in her craft until she proved it with her hands. She imagined Nathaniel carrying these records through dark streets, knowing every step might be his last, yet refusing to destroy evidence simply to save himself. The final pages described his last plan. He intended to send duplicate evidence east, aboard a freight train departing before sunrise. If he failed, he would hide everything beneath the freight platform. Then came the final sentence. If Black Alder ever deserves its true history, someone honest will eventually arrive. No signature. Only a small ink stain where the pen had stopped. Evelyn closed her eyes for several moments. But outside, dawn's first pale light had begun touching the eastern hills. She had worked through the entire night without noticing. Birdsong slowly replaced the endless chorus of crickets. The abandoned station no longer felt abandoned. It felt occupied by memory. She stood and walked outside carrying Nathaniel's map. Morning mist drifted across the empty railway yard. The old loading platform looked ordinary enough. No passerby would ever imagine that beneath those stones, history had slept undisturbed for over 40 years. As she studied the map again, something else caught her attention. Several locations had been marked with tiny circles connected by faint pencil lines. The circles corresponded to buildings no longer standing: an old freight warehouse, a water tower, the original survey office, a chapel destroyed by fire decades earlier. Each location carried one small initial, BRHL. They matched surnames appearing throughout the notebook. Witnesses, people Nathaniel had trusted, people whose testimonies had disappeared from official records. Perhaps they had hidden additional evidence, or perhaps they had left behind descendants who still unknowingly possessed fragments of the truth. She folded the map carefully. If the conspiracy reached as deeply as the ledgers suggested, exposing it would not simply correct history. It would challenge the foundations upon which several prominent fortunes had been built. She looked across Black Alder. Though smaller than in Nathaniel's day, the town still contained prosperous merchants whose grand brick buildings overlooked weathered cottages occupied by descendants of families who had supposedly failed through their own misfortune. What if they had never failed? What if they had simply been robbed so thoroughly that even their grandchildren believed the official story? A wagon rattled slowly down the main street. The driver tipped his hat politely toward Evelyn before continuing. He had no idea that only a few yards away sat enough evidence to transform everything Black Alder believed about itself. Neither did the banker unlocking his office, nor the school children laughing as they hurried toward lessons. The town awoke peacefully, unaware that its forgotten telegraph station had finally delivered the message it had been unable to send 40 years before. Evelyn gathered every document back into the iron box, except for Nathaniel's first letter, which she slipped carefully into her satchel. She would need to decide whom she could trust. Not everyone deserved to see these papers. Nathaniel had made that mistake once. She had no intention of repeating it. As she secured the station door, she noticed movement across the street. Standing outside the finest building in Black Alder was a tall gentleman dressed in an immaculate dark coat, watching the old telegraph station with quiet interest. He had arrived silently enough that she had not noticed him before. When their eyes met, he smiled politely. It was not the warm smile of a curious neighbor. It was the measured smile of a man calculating something. He tipped his hat just enough to acknowledge her, turned without a word, and disappeared into the brick office bearing a polished brass sign. Black Alder Land and Development Company. Evelyn felt an uneasy weight settle in her chest. She had discovered Nathaniel Ashcombe's secret. Now, without speaking a single word, someone else had discovered that the abandoned telegraph station was no longer abandoned. Years passed, yet the abandoned telegraph station never again stood empty. The truth Evelyn uncovered spread slowly, just as Nathaniel had believed it would. Judges reopened forgotten records. Historians compared the hidden ledgers with the official archives. And one by one, the stories that had burdened innocent families for decades were finally corrected. Land that could not legally be returned was honored in another way, through fair compensation, public acknowledgement, and the restoration of family names that had long carried undeserved shame. The grand fortunes built upon deception quietly unraveled beneath the weight of undeniable evidence, while those who had once dismissed the old station came to understand that the greatest treasures are often not gold or silver, but truth, patiently preserved until the right heart is ready to uncover it. Evelyn accepted none of the wealth offered to her for the discovery. Instead, she asked that the abandoned telegraph station be restored as a public reading room and town archive where every child could learn the real history of Black Alder. The magnificent walnut desk remained exactly where Nathaniel had left it, carefully polished, its hidden compartment preserved as a reminder that honesty sometimes waits many years before it is heard. Travelers began stopping there, not to send telegrams, but to read the letters that had finally reached their destinations, even if decades late. Descendants of the families once forgotten gathered each autumn beneath the station's porch, sharing stories, repairing old furniture together, planting trees, and remembering the woman who had chosen restoration over revenge. Children often asked why Evelyn never kept the documents locked away for herself, and she would simply smile before saying that truth grows stronger only when it is shared. The little station, once abandoned by everyone, became the heart of Black Alder once again, proving that one act of quiet courage could restore an entire community more completely than years of anger ever could. In her later years, Evelyn would sometimes sit beside the window where she had first opened Nathaniel Ashcombe's letter. She would watch sunlight fall across the old desk and think of her father saying that wood keeps secrets only until the right hands arrive. He had been right all along. The desk had waited for her, just as she had unknowingly been preparing her whole life to find it. The girl who had once been cast out with only a few coins had become the guardian of a town's forgotten soul, and the place everyone believed was worthless became the place that restored hope to generations. If you have stayed with us until the end of Evelyn's journey, thank you for sharing this quiet adventure through the American frontier. Stories like these remind us that what the world overlooks often carries the greatest value, and that kindness, patience, and integrity never truly disappear. They simply wait for someone willing to uncover them. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment telling us about a time you discovered unexpected value in something, or someone, others had given up on. And if you enjoy heartfelt frontier stories filled with mystery, resilience, and hope, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again here at Berry Tales. Until our next story, may you always find treasure where others see only dust, and may every forgotten path lead you home.